So, what in the world is Donald Trump and America up to in Asia? That's the big question that you're going to be asking if you're an Asian country like India. You've been hit by tariffs. You're not really sure what Donald Trump's policy is on China or what America really believes in this administration about the Indo-Pacific. Joining us now is one of America's foremost experts on Asia to help us decode what's happening about America's policy in the Indo-Pacific. It's Dr. Evan Feigenbaum, who's been Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment. He's also been Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, handling South Asia and also East Asia. Dr. Feigenbaum, thank you so much for joining us here on Hindustan Times. Could I ask you to just begin by giving us your sense of where America stands right now in the Indo-Pacific? You have been a persistent critic of what you see as certain shortfalls in terms of how America is conceptualizing its foreign policy towards Asia. So what do you think America is doing right and what it isn't doing?
Yeah, I think my direct answer to your very direct question is that the United States is not especially well positioned in Asia and is certainly not as well positioned as the strategic class in Washington, of which I'm a card-carrying member, actually thinks it is.
Mm.
I think there are two baseline assumptions that a lot of people in Washington make. The first is that most countries in the region fear Chinese power. And then, second, because countries fear Chinese power, they will inevitably and eternally look to the United States essentially to provide security related public goods that keep the region stable. And that's true up to a point, but the problem is that it misunderstands a lot of the much more complex dynamics in the region. Asia is filled with sizable, capable, self interested countries with large economies that want to have a say in the future of the region. And what's more, the future of the region is not just going to be determined by security related issues or by military power, but by economic power, financial power, technological power. And on that, there are more than two countries, not just the United States and China, that are setting the terms of trade. And the terms of interaction, and thus the region's future. And so, for that reason, the region really isn't bipolar in the way that a lot of American strategists think it is. So that leads to my point about why the US isn't doing well. For one thing, over the last 15 or 20 years, Asia has become progressively more integrated. East Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, which used to be really in a lot of ways disconnected regions, both strategically and economically, are becoming more integrated and also more Asian. There's Chinese money, Japanese money, Korean money, Indian money flowing across the region. China's become the largest trading partner for most of these countries, the largest investment partner. And if you think about that larger Eurasian space, the United States is diplomatically challenged and commercially invisible from about 60 to 65% of the Eurasian landmass, all of Central Asia, minus Kazakhstan in one or two extractive sectors, pretty much all of South Asia, minus India, and most of mainland Southeast Asia, minus Vietnam. So that's a pretty hefty chunk of Asia. And meanwhile, given the trajectory of the US-China relationship, China's trying to make itself less dependent and less integrated with the United States economically, financially, and in other ways too.
Right.
Second, the region's not just about China. If it was, for instance, then all of the trade pacts in the region would be determined either by the United States or by China. But some of the most important trade pacts in the region, for instance, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, don't include the United States or China. So a very China-centric approach that tries to refract every relationship, initiative, and policy through the prism of China policy, that's a mistake that makes the United States much less relevant. And finally, the US is much too security centric. It's long on security, short on everything else. And because US trade with every country in Asia may be going up in absolute terms, but is declining everywhere in relative terms, if you pull that thread out 15, 20 years, the United States will become progressively less relevant as a demand driver, which means it needs to be more of a standard setter. In a lot of ways, the US is abdicating that role too. So when I add all of that up, a more Asian Asia, and not just China-centric Asia, not just security-centric Asia, what I see is a US that's long on security, short on other things, long on attitude, short on strategy. And as an American, I worry about that trajectory.
Right. And something you said about this was very interesting. You've talked about the need for America to be more engaged. I wanted to get your sense of how important, how well do you think the Trump administration understands that objective? Because you're seeing on economics and trade that they don't want to be part of trade agreements. They're slapping tariffs on countries left, right, and center. You've had some questioning of the AUKUS alliance going on. You've There's some volatility in the relationship with Japan, with Australia, with India. Really, America's key allies in the region seem to be slightly leery of the Trump administration at this point in time. And then added to that, of course, is the whole drama we've seen with the tariffs. So my question to you is, how do you think the Trump administration is handling this? Do you think they're making the problem that you've described worse?
Yes, absolutely. Because they don't have a strategy. I mean,
Right.
a strategy requires that you identify a theory of victory and then you work backwards from that and you match means to ends. It's not clear that there's a theory of victory either around American engagement for the long term or around a favorable balance of power for the United States or around an organizing concept for the region's institutions, rules, norms, and standards. And so, in the absence of that, what you have is essentially the President of the United States depending on whether he gets out of bed on the left side or the right side, what pops into his head essentially determines American policy.
Right.
So that's neither a principled approach nor a strategic approach. And so where you land is with a very ad hoc approach that reflects the man's personality. But also, as you're implying when you talked about all these trade deals, let's not
Mhm.
call them trade agreements because they're deals that really are at the border and don't involve long-term structural reform and competition policy. What you have essentially is rent seeking and transactional behavior, and
Mhm.
that's not really a recipe for strategy. If they had a principled approach, what they would have is a philosophy of what the region should look like. Biden tried one with democracy versus autocracy. To my mind, that doesn't really fit Asian realities very well, but nonetheless, we can argue that it's a concept that's anchored in some sort of principled approach to the region. This administration doesn't have that. If they had a strategic approach, for example, to counter the rise of Chinese power or constrain Chinese power in some way, you certainly would not tariff all your allies, pick fights with all your allies. What you would do is try to build coalitions of countries. And outside the security domain where the defense secretary, Mr. Hegseth, has said things that are largely consistent with what prior administrations have said. The administration doesn't particularly have a strategic approach. And you see that even in the agreements they're reaching. They reached an agreement with the Philippines yesterday. Mr. Marcos, the president of the Philippines, it's not even been 24 hours. He's already walking back some of the claims that the United States was making around the agreement. Some of the things that have ostensibly been agreed with Japan are absolutely fantastical from the standpoint of anybody who's ever dealt with a Japanese corporation. So, that being the case, essentially what we have is a personality driven policy. And I think against the backdrop of the structural challenges I described at the beginning, I worry that 5 years hence, 10 years hence, the United States is going to be even further out of the picture in Asia. And as I said, that concerns me.
Right. Could you tell us a little bit about how you see China playing their cards in Asia? Do you think they're doing a much better job than the United States in that regard?
Yeah, I don't actually. I think if the Chinese were a little less strategically clumsy, they could leverage this moment to
Hmm.
long-term effect. But the Chinese often say that it's the United States that's gotten into the middle of their relationships with third players. Somehow there's this dark hand of the United States behind.
Absolutely, right.
But it's remarkably unself-reflective. I mean, if you look at the trajectory of China's relations with India, with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, with Europe, with lots of places around the world, all of those have become more challenging for China in tandem. Having said that, I think that Chinese policy is fairly realistic about the nature of the challenge with the United States. It's pretty clear that Mr. Trump doesn't have a particularly principled commitment to a hawkish approach to China, but that's partly because he doesn't really have more than a transactional approach with China. But if you're a student of American politics, as the Chinese are, and you look at the trajectory over the last 7 to 10 years, you might conclude that over the longer term, the cake is largely baked in ways that will not rewind the clock back to the kind of broadly cooperative relationship the United States and China enjoyed in the past.
Right.
That being the case, what I think I see is the Chinese trying to ring fence the relationship with the United States to prevent and mitigate the worst outcomes, and then find ways, albeit tentatively, to improve other relationships in concentric circles. First with industrial East Asia, second with Asia more broadly, then with other partners of the United States, Europe, Australia. Mr. Albanese was just in China for 6 days, and then further out with the global South. broadly speaking, they're not doing too badly at that. I mean, they're
Mhm.
not doing incredibly well. They're not leveraging American clumsiness for a long-term effect to rewrite the rules of order in Asia. There's a lot of countries in the region, including but not limited to India, that are skeptical of the rise of Chinese power.
Right.
But I think they've made some strides in improving their relationships with various countries. And that's particularly true in the global south.
So, Dr. Feigenbaum, something that our viewers may not know about you is that you were part of the State Department team that got the India-US nuclear deal over the line. And I wanted to leverage that and ask you a little bit about India's perspective on this, because towards the north we've got China. As you mentioned, China continues to believe that the United States is the reason why India and China are clashing. We've seen border tensions in the past, and there is very much a sense in New Delhi that China is not to be trusted. But at the same time, America, which with whom we had built a stronger strategic partnership over the last 25 years, there's a sense again that those old fears that the Americans are not as reliable as we would like them to be. How would you advise a country like India to think about its foreign policy, given that it seems to be caught between a rock and a hard place between Xi Jinping's China and Trump's America on the other side?
Well, it's not for me to advise India, and Americans always get in trouble when they try to do so. What I would say is that there are probably limits on the extent and intensity with which India and China can improve their relationship. There's a lot of suspicion. There are security dilemmas. Notwithstanding a border peace and tranquility agreement, there are issues on the border. It's not just about Galwan. It goes back further. I do think there's room to improve things. And my impression is that on a bilateral basis, that seems to be happening. And Mr. Jaishankar and Mr. Doval deserve some of the credit for that. The recent visits they've made, the meetings that they've held seem to be moving things along. Having said that, the critique, if you reflect on it, that I made of American policy was that it's a mistake to refract Asia policy through the prism of the bilateral security competition with China.
Mm,
And that, as my former boss in the State Department, Richard Armitage, used to say, the way to get China policy right is really to get Asia policy right,
mm,
really ought to apply to India in some way too.
mm,
And I think as an outside observer, just reflecting on India's policy, I've been struck by some of the limits that India seems to have placed on itself in terms of its bilateral relationships, but also some of its regional relationships. If you go back to what I said about the trade space earlier, I mentioned, for example, the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, but that's one of three agreements: the CPTPP, the so-called Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is well known to people in India, the
right.
RCEP, and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, or the DEPA agreement. Those three pacts are going to set standards in the region for the next decade and a half, and they reflect the aspirations and efforts by some of the most assertive first movers in Asia to try to write rules and define terms. It's not just the United States that's on the outside of not one, not two, but all three of those agreements. India is on the outside of all three of those. And it's hard to talk about an Indo-Pacific as the basis of regional strategy if the largest economy in the Indo and the largest economy across the Pacific are both missing in action.
Mm,
So I understand, for example, the domestic constraints that influenced India's debate about whether to remain inside the RCEP tent. It was widely portrayed, I know, in Indian domestic politics as essentially an open door for Chinese dumping into the Indian market. However, it's put India on the wrong side of a tariff wall at a time when the East Asian region is becoming much more integrated. So, by focusing on protecting what it had rather than on shaping the future in ways that would have leveraged and created new opportunities, India actually has accelerated the opening of the door to China in Southeast Asia in ways that I think will rebound back in very negative ways onto its regional positioning and posture. And you can see that in some of the just trade statistics and supply chain relationships. China's something like 13, 14, 15% of ASEAN trade. A lot of that is tariff skirting behavior, integrated supply chains. India is still hovering down below 5% of that. And some of that has has to do with the domestic setup in India around factor reforms, but some of it also has to do with regional policy. And so I think if I were sitting in India, I would want to be thinking more about how regional policy impacted on how I was postured vis-a-vis China. And I think as an outside observer, again, some people in India often make the same mistake that I think a lot of us in the United States make, which is that we refract Asia through the prism of China rather than the other way around.
Dr. Feigenbaum, I have to ask you because you began your career as someone who was an expert in China, and you of course observed the country very closely over the last couple of decades. For an Indian audience, could you also explain what, to your view, in your view, is what is China's objective in the Indo-Pacific more generally? What sort of position does it hope to acquire in Asia? And would a country like India, there's a question about is there an accommodation that can be reached with China that is acceptable to India as well? We're seeing increasingly conversations between India and China on broader strategic issues, a question of normalization. Lots of people in India are asking, okay, we can normalize, but on what terms? What does China want in Asia more generally that India can live with? So, your sense of what China seems to want in the region more generally.
I mean, that's one of the most debated questions out there, and there's not one answer to that. Depends a lot on your perspective, and it depends a lot on what part of the elephant, or maybe we should call it the dragon, that you touch. I think that de minimis for China, particularly in its immediate East Asian periphery, is essentially to be able to exercise a veto on strategic economic and institutional arrangements that it views as inimical to its interests. And by its interests, I mean the interests as defined by the Chinese Communist Party that rules China. And so if you think about both territorial claims, institutional arrangements, the way China complains about developments in US security partnerships and alliances, essentially, I think the de minimis on where China would like to land is be able to use pressure or inducements to basically ensure that none of that happens in a way that's inimical to China's interests as it's defined them. More broadly, I think there's a lot of imputing objectives to China about what it wants. It depends whether you see it through an ideological prism or otherwise. I mean, in a lot of ways, China is a revisionist power, but it's a highly strategic revisionist rather than necessarily always a wholesale revisionist. I'll give you one example, which is an institutional example. At the time, China played such a large role in shaping the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It was an institution that's become more like a multilateral development bank, but is still heavily influenced by China and was birthed really as a Chinese idea in Beijing. A lot of people argued that this was a direct counterpart to the Asian Development Bank. But China is still, if I'm not mistaken, the number three shareholder in the Asian Development Bank. And so, and even the AIB does a lot of co-lending with other MDBs. So in that sense, even when China designs new institutions that reflect China's ambitions, desires, and perspective, I would argue that it is a kind of portfolio diversification approach rather than necessarily a wholesale rip and replacement approach. And that, in a sense, if you're sitting in India, is a more complex and variegated landscape to deal with. If you're dealing with a power that just seeks to rip and replace all institutions, norms, standards, and arrangements in the regional order, there's not a lot that you can do except to challenge it frontally and across the board and with partners. But because China presents a much more complex challenge, and because in some multilateral settings, India and China actually share some predilections about multipolarity, although they don't always mean the same thing by that, about the way the international order that's prevailed since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 ought to continue. And because they share some ambivalence, ironically enough, albeit for different reasons, about American foreign policy, and particularly about the tools of American statecraft, like the wielding of unilateral sanctions. Sometimes India and China find themselves on the same side in expressing preferences and desires about international order, even though they get there for very different reasons. From an American perspective, that's a bit of a warning shot because I think if I think about what the world is going to look like in 10 years, it's going to be a much less American centric and transatlantic centered world. And countries like India and China will play a much larger role in shaping that. And in areas where they sometimes share perspectives, but in other cases it's for different reasons, the United States needs to be careful about not pushing them together
Right.
as a byproduct of American policy. And that's what I worry about, for instance, in some of the discussion about sanctions bills that would target India in the
Right.
United
And you have given me the perfect segue into my next set of questions, which is back to bring the focus back to the India US relationship. Let me just start with what we saw a couple of months ago with Operation Sindoor, with the Indian military strikes on Pakistan. The Americans, of course, played a role in mediating the ceasefire, but then Donald Trump, of course, announces the ceasefire before both countries can say anything about it, and also says, by the way, there's going to be mediation on Kashmir and other disputes in neutral third location, which India very vigorously opposes. Then, of course, you see the Trump administration start to reach out more to Pakistan. You've seen the Pakistani Army Chief Asim Munir visit Washington and meet President Trump. And so increasingly, there is this sense of whiplash, which is what happened over these last couple of months. Is this a part of some larger strategic tilt towards the Pakistanis, or is this just Donald Trump being Donald Trump and looking for a tactical advantages? So my question to you, Dr. Feigenbaum, it's a large question, but how do we make sense of what we've seen in the India-US relationship vis-a-vis, especially Pakistan, over the last couple of months?
Yeah, I wouldn't overread that, to be blunt about it. I mean, I'm from New York City, where we have something called alternate side of the street parking, where on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday you can park on one side of the street, and Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday you can park on the other side of the street. It's a traffic flow measure
Mhm.
for your listeners who haven't been to New York City.
Yeah.
President Trump's a little like alternate side of the street parking. On 3 days of the week, he says one thing. On 3 days of the week, he says another thing. And as I said earlier in answer to your second question, there's not a lot of discipline to it. So I wouldn't overread a lot of that. And I don't think it reflects, as I was saying earlier, either a principled view or a particularly organized strategic concept. I
Right.
also wouldn't overread the mediation point about Kashmir. To have mediation, both parties have to agree to mediation. There's a 0% chance that India is going to agree to American mediation, and that's always been the case. And Mr. Modi's government has made that clear once again. By the way, I'm old enough to remember when prior American presidential candidates, I think President Obama when he was running for president, maybe President Clinton when he was running for president, muttered things along this line as well. And I had the good fortune to work for President George W. Bush, one of the only presidents that had the discipline not to say things like that about
Right.
India or South. So that kind of stuff seeps out all the time, and I really wouldn't overread it. I think the larger issue is really what the trajectory of the U.S.-India relationship is going to look like.
Mhm.
Because to be blunt about it, this idea that the U.S. is going to rehyphenate India with Pakistan, I mean, I get where that critique is coming from in India, and I understand it, particularly after the shenanigans with Pakistan that have taken place in the last few months from the administration in Washington. However, I'm here to tell you that there are not a lot of people in Washington these days, inside or outside the administration, who don't think about India on a larger stage.
Mhm.
And when people think about India strategically, they tend, as I was actually critiquing earlier, to do it more through the prism of Chinese power than through the prism of hyphenation with Pakistan. So I think
Right.
those days are kind of over. I think the larger question is, what does an ambitious agenda for the relationship look like? Given that we have an administration that has its particular predilections on trade policy, is pushing India to take steps on the economic front that will be domestically combustible
Mhm.
in India, and that Mr. Modi and Mr. Goyal are not necessarily going to want to take and won't like being pushed into. The fact that technology was really, in a lot of ways, the most promising area of the US India trajectory, but this is an administration that also has a lot of techno nationalists in it, who have a strongly held belief that technology should be held closer to home and not just shared willy-nilly. So I think this larger question of, kind of where we're going to grow the relationship against the backdrop of this trade stuff, technology pressures, the fact that India is not going to get pushed into an anti-China alliance at American behest, nor thinks the U.S. would be reliable as a partner if things came to blows between India and China? I think that's really the question. I think the first thing is to clear out the air in the trade space.
Mhm.
And so I wish Mr. Goyal and Mr. Besant a lot of luck in their effort to do that. Um, I think the challenge there is that, as I said, number one, a lot of the areas the US is pushing on are combustible domestically in India. But second, there's not a lot of rhyme or reason to the administration's approach. I mean, they've smacked countries with tariffs with which the US has a trade deficit in goods, but also countries with which it has a trade surplus. They've smacked countries with which the US has an FTA, a free trade agreement, but also countries with which it does not have an FTA.
Mhm.
They've done deals, but then they've imposed tariffs on completely unrelated issues like drug trafficking, or, as you saw with President Trump's comments about the BRICS grouping, strategic developments that he doesn't like. So I think one question people in India are going to ask is whether an agreement can stick, and whether the U.S. will be reliable in that. That'll depend a lot on where they land and on the relationship between Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi. My guess is India's objective is to make this go away, and to try to find a de minimis deal that works for India but relieves some of this pressure. I think the larger question is going to be around defense and technology, and there. I do have some concerns. The last administration, for all its flaws, had an initiative on critical and emerging technologies between the US and India. It had a lot of promise. It aligned very nicely with India's national semiconductor mission, quantum mission. There was some push and pull around data governance, cross-border data, data localization. But the US and India made a lot of progress there. And I think at some point we're going to have to confront this question now that this administration has renamed that initiative and fired many of the people who were working on it,
Absolutely.
about what a long-term ambitious technology sharing and co-innovation agenda would look like.
Right.
And I don't think we're there yet.
Right. Let me ask you two final questions then, Dr. Feigenbaum. Number one, in an ideal world, what would the US-India partnership be doing? What would you, let's say, you were the powers that be, and how would you transform the India-US relationship or want to push the India-US relationship in a way that it contributes to the kind of Asian order that you would like to see? What can the two countries do together starting today that pushes them in a better direction and a better trajectory?
Well, I mean, that's a big question. It's going to depend a lot on India's trajectory and what India's own ambitions are. I'd say it has a few pieces. One is, I think the American narrative about India needs to change, but also India's own view of its possibilities needs to change. For most of my career, Americans in particular have talked about India more as an object than a subject. For example, a place that needs to be reformed rather than as a place that has pioneered ideas, innovations, or initiatives through its own reform process that might be exported and scaled in other parts of the world in which the US has a strategic interest. Partnering with India, but also looking to India to do things around the world. Not across the board, not in a comprehensive way, not to rival China's posture and presence in every region of the world, but in ways that reflect India's own unique experiences and offerings. For instance, on things like digital public infrastructure, or on bringing people into the organized financial system. That has resonance in places like Africa or the Middle East or the Pacific Islands, that matters to the United States strategically, and that's not really been part of the conversation.
Mhm.
Second, we clearly need to grow the economic relationship, and that's going to require some reforms in India. I don't need to give you chapter and verse on that. Your listeners are probably familiar with that. But there are a whole variety of structural reforms and competition reforms in India that are clearly needed, both to open up market opportunities to the United States to grow the trade and investment relationship, but also for co-innovation that also in turn might be scaled elsewhere. Third, I think the US values India as a partner in the wider Asian region. But as I was saying earlier, having India on the outside of a lot of trade and supply chain pacts, agreements, and structured relationships and institutions is not helpful to that objective. So the more we can have a candid conversation about what would increase and grow India's own posture in Asia, particularly outside the security domain and the technology, financial, and economic domain,
Mhm.
that could be meaningful in shaping a balance of power that matters. And third, I think we need to stop trying to reinvent the civil nuclear initiative.
Mhm.
I was very closely involved in the final phase of that in 2008. I was co-chair of the interagency process in the U.S. government. I was the day-to-day point of contact with the government of India on a number of things. I was in Vienna for the
Mm.
nuclear suppliers group
Right.
meetings in August and September 2008. Um, and that was a unique moment. We don't need one big thing. We can have accumulation of things, but we need to clear away some of this underbrush, and we also need to not just Chinify our relationship. We need to think a little
Right.
bit more broadly about what partnership means in a more multipolar
Mm.
and multifaceted world.
My last question then, Dr. Feigenbaum, is what does the world look like, or what does Asia look like in 10 to 15 years, as you were mentioning, if America doesn't get it right? And if India doesn't get it right, what does it look like? What's the
It's
worst
going to
case scenario here?
I think it's going to be highly fragmented, where what you see will depend a lot on what it is you want to explain. If I think about trade rules, I think they're going to be set by a variety of agreements, many of which will not include the United States. Because my prediction to you is that the United States may never again do another multilateral or major plurilateral trade agreement in this or any other part of the world. And so, in that sense, in various sectors, on various industries, we're going to have a much more fragmented landscape. In the security domain, I think the region may start to look much more bipolar between the United States and China, but that a lot of countries are going to resist that. And because they're going to resist that, what that's going to mean is there may not be a comprehensive, security architecture the way we have in other regions. But nonetheless, there's going to be a lot of toing and froing, tacking back and forth, and very fluid coalitions. I think the most important question, though, that I don't have the answer on is who's going to drive coalition building on the issues and functions that really matter to Asian people. And if you think about the things that are closest to the ground of people's lives, it's not the big abstract geopolitics. If you're sitting in Sarawak or you're sitting in Philippine Island or you're sitting in Bangladesh, it's not necessarily the big geopolitics around the Taiwan Strait or around the Korean Peninsula. It's really around an agenda that is closer to home: growth, employment, upskilling, sustainability, technological transformation. And the future of the region is going to really be determined by who provides solutions and offerings on those things that matter. Those that do are going to be those who can exercise influence and those who build trust and those whom people ultimately will want their governments to trust. Those who don't will find themselves progressively excluded from the region. So the way I see the region is ultimately, notwithstanding the geopolitical tension, it's going to be about addition and multiplication, not subtraction and division. And I think the United States is in danger of no longer offering solutions. I don't want India to fall into the same trap. And as an American, I don't really want to see a China-centric region where only China is trying to provide solutions. So I think what we're going to see is a much more fragmented region where the bar of expectation is going to be much higher for external powers, particularly kind of distant countries like the United States that have been part of the region historically, but are increasingly viewed as self-interested to rise to the occasion and speak to the aspirations of Asians. That's a pretty high bar, and both India and the United States need to get over it.
Understood. Dr. Feigenbaum, thank you so much for joining us here at HT and giving us your insights. Thank you so much.
Thanks.